A few years ago, I went camping for the first time in my life. I was about 11 or 12 when we headed out to a forest nearby our house. We were in Poland for the holidays, as every year, and right next to our house was a huge forest. So one day, we decided to take out my mom's old tent she still had from like the 90s, and just stay for the night or two in between some wildlife. Good thing. The place we chose to sleep at was only about 20, maybe 30 minutes away from the house. Bad thing. There are a lot, and I mean a lot, of wolves, foxes, and boars out in that forest. And honestly, I kind of regretted going out there in the first place. We set everything up at around 6 p.m., and my sister and I set up the campfire. My dad chopped down a smaller tree earlier with his oak axe, important for later part of the story, and by now it had dried out enough to catch fire. We sat around it for quite some time, probably around 4 hours, until it was dark, so we decided to just head to sleep then. My two sisters and I on one end of the tent, and my parents on the other. It was probably just the fear of getting eaten alive by some wolves, or homesickness, but I couldn't sleep at all. I heard my dad tell my mom he was going out into the forest to get some wood for the morning while it was still fairly dry, or it would have soaked up all the dew by then. The thought of not having my dad around made it even worse for me to even close my eyes for a second. I'm not too good at telling what time it is by just staring at the sky, or trying to figure out how long it has been, so I'll just say it was around 12 or 1 in the morning. I was actually falling asleep when I heard some rattling outside my tent. My first thought, wolf. I was terrified and so just popped out my head through the little curtain that separated the two halves of the tent. Basically a thin piece of fabric just hanging on some threads, to see if my dad was back. He was still gone, and it had been about an hour since he went. I lay back down and just tried to fall asleep, but when I turned myself on my side, I saw this faint human shadow outside the tent. I froze and let out a teeny squeak. The person seemed to be holding some sort of axe, shovel-type thing in its hand, and so I thought it may have just been my dad coming back. The shadow walked towards the entrance of the tent and just stood there, at the zipped-up door for maybe 30 seconds. I began to wonder why he wasn't just coming inside. The person finally ran off into the forest, but it dropped the axe. You could hear the footsteps fade in the distance and a thump just appear along the way. Maybe a minute or so later, I hear my dad walking back from the opposite side of the forest and enter the tent all tired and just fell asleep. Seemed kind of sketchy and fishy and scary to me, but it was so late I couldn't even think anymore and I somehow fell asleep. The next morning, I woke up after my dad dropped his phone on his face, letting out an ouch. I peeped through the curtain at him, and he just smiled back while rubbing his nose. I needed some fresh air because I was feeling a bit sick, maybe from the nerves in the morning or homesickness, I couldn't really tell. Both of us got out of the tent and walked around for a while. We circled around the campsite for around 10 minutes until we came back to our tent. That's when I noticed something that ran the chills down my back. A few meters from the tent, in the corner of my eye, I managed to catch a glimpse of something red. It took me a hot second to realize I actually saw something, and when I turned my head to see what it was a red and black rubber axe. It was not there before. I knew it wasn't my dad's, because his was by the pile of wood he collected at night. From my dad's reaction, I probably turned pale because he started to freak out a little, like I was about to pass out or something. He turned his gaze to where I was looking, and we both just stared for a few seconds before he called out for the rest of the family to wake up and get moving. We were all packed up within an hour, and we rushed back home. I later told my dad what I saw that night, and he wouldn't believe me at first. I carried on with the story, and he finally realized I was telling the truth. To this day, I still have no clue who the heck that was, but I'm just happy he didn't investigate our tent any further or any other animal out there in that forest. To the axe man who was outside my tent in the middle of the night, let's not meet. For a little background story, I've been a scout since I was 8 years old, and last year I was the leader of my team, so I had to do all the paperwork and calls for finding places to camp. It was mid-November, I had to find a place to camp, but since I was lazy, I decided to wait a week before the actual weekend. A week before the weekend, I decided to call some owners so I can have a place to sleep. As I call many numbers, all of the owners are unavailable or simply not there. But then I see a number which I never called before, since it's at the end of the list. I called, and an old lady picked up the phone. I do the basic presentation and all. She agreed to let me and my team stay at her place, and we make all the arrangements. That afternoon, I go to her property to check everything, such as potable water, the place to put the tent, and the campfire. The place is kind of dark, but it's nice. The week passes and Saturday arrives. The Saturday ended well. We did some great games, we ate a lot, and we had a good night show. As they go to sleep in the tent, I stay awake to finish paperwork for the next day. It's now around midnight, and I decide to go to sleep because we have to wake up early to go to church. As I switch off the flashlight, one of the newbies, there were 8 in total, wants to go to the toilets, also known as a tree, and asks me to come with her. I can understand because it's better to be accompanied in the night, especially in the woods. She does her business, and I suddenly hear some noises far away, but not that far. I tell myself it's nothing. It must be some animals trying to find food. We go back to the tent, and that's when I hear footsteps approaching. As I hear those footsteps, I remain calm and tell myself maybe it's the old lady making sure we didn't make a fire too close or something. But I still have an odd feeling because it's midnight, and why would she do that at that hour? Then I hear no more footsteps for about 10 minutes. Then I hear more coming to our tents. Thankfully, all of my girls are sleeping because they would have been scared. As I hear footsteps, which seems to come from one person, I hear others coming from the back of the tent. And I was like, okay, this is getting weird. I need to do something. I check by the side of the tent, and thank God, one of the newbies left some embers from the fire, so I could see what happens between the fire and the zip of the tent. A minute passes by, and a silhouette is there just between the fire and my tent. I stopped breathing. I literally froze. I started to move towards my phone when I saw the silhouette coming closer to the zipper of the tent. I sent a message to one of my bosses who was always camping in the near areas if something happened, but I knew she would take too long, so I had to think of something, and think fast. That's when I had an idea. I put my alarm on like a big siren, because sometimes we would do like night games and wake up in the middle of the night. So I put my bell on, and my girls woke up. The silhouette had started to unzip the tent. I actually saw fingers from below. But as the silhouette heard my girls waking up, she or he sprinted back to where he came from. That's when I saw 2 other silhouettes sprinting back in the same direction. Everything ended well, and 20 minutes later my boss came and stayed the night, and I never had to deal with those silhouettes again, thankfully. My wife and I hiked and camped quite a bit before we had our first kid. Some backpacking, but mostly car camping that requires a good drive down a forest road. In 2016, we decided after 3 nights in a national forest and adjacent national park, we'd stay at an FS campsite, a change from dispersed camping, a ways from any town, but still a campsite with a bathroom. We had a wonderful time during the day, swam in a lake, yada yada, awesome place. The campsite was mostly busy with small families. One noteworthy group, Loudish people, though well out of sight on the other side of a stand of trees. They brought many cars of all types, at least those that could drive down the road, non-paved, for a good 2 miles. Not bad though, but whatever, let people have fun. I didn't care about the noise. Come night, we go to bed early. No fire as we wake up early to hike before the sun beats down. The group is still loud. My wife does the earplugs. I'm able to ignore it and sleep. No problem. Come 1 a.m., I wake up, perhaps due to the group noise, I don't know. I can hear fewer of them, maybe 4 or 5 people that were audible, enough to make out every 4th or 5th word. Loud drunkenness, but it was initially friendly, cursing, laughing. Next thing, I hear a guy call a lady a vagina, but not so nicely. And shit goes downhill from there. Now they are yelling expletives that I can mostly make out because of the yelling. Women and men both telling each other to fuck off. Luckily my wife is still out sleeping. Out of this mess of people yelling, a woman just starts screaming, shrieking. Something changed and happened to her. This wasn't just someone joining the verbal fight. This was the first time my heart rate went up. What the hell is happening? Even while others in the group are still yelling, I can tell the shrieking girl is moving away from the group, but is still yelling loud, like distorting your voice yelling. Her yells turn into words, help, as she moves. And hell, I can begin to tell she is getting closer to the tent site area where I am. Screaming girl is getting closer, but it's hard to tell. Then her screams for help become clear, where I'm able to make out, help, someone is trying to stab me. I can hear her move from the road to the parking area where my car is parked, coming closer to the trailhead that connects to my campsite. In my head, I'm like, oh my god, oh my god, oh my god, don't come to the trail, don't come to the trail. My tent is the first one once you enter the trail. My wife is sleeping through the yelling still. I might sound like an asshole for not jumping up and playing the hero here, but screw that. I'm not touching drunk people drama. Sure enough, she starts down the trail. The trail splits and I'm on the right. I'm thinking, go left, go left. My wife is starting to wake up, pulls out the earplugs. I turn to her. It's okay, it's okay. Nope, yelling girl turns right, walks right up to our tent, stands next to it. Help me, can you please help me? She's sobbing. I get up first and open the tent. In the twilight and the light from the girl's phone, I can see that she's a teenager. Drunk as hell, not bleeding or stabbed, luckily. I'm tired and don't respond well, sputtering a bit. Saying things like, I don't know, we can't. My wife pops up and handles the situation like a boss. Calming her down, asking her name, sitting her down on the picnic table, de-escalating. The short version of the girl's story is, she's 16, her cousin got jealous about hugging her boyfriend, threatened and maybe tried to stab the 16-year-old. All were drinking. Meanwhile, we can hear people over in the campsite continuing to rage, yelling at each other. It's now mostly just two guys yelling at each other. My wife instructs the girl to drink water and stay away from her cousin. They were going over options. I'm trying to use either of our phones, wife's and mine, to call the police. No signal. Luckily, other campers have woken up and come to our area. They have a signal and call the police. The girl has calmed down at this point and wants to leave. We are all wary as we can still hear the dudes screaming at each other. The girl abruptly leaves. Wife and I, plus two other campers, are standing in the parking area near the trail, just wondering what it's all about. The dudes yelling in the background escalate to a fist fight. You can hear skin slaps like someone got popped, falling into shrubs, shouting. The four of us sitting there waiting for the police. This goes on for a while. 30 minutes and no police. Understandable given the location. Suddenly, the 16-year-old girl comes back. She has half a fifth of vodka in her hand. Now she is cursing. I'm gonna mess her up. I have guns. My mom has a gun at her house. My wife and the two campers whip out their negotiation skills and talk her down. Wife gets 16-year-old to give up the bottle and sit on the ground. Do you think messing her up is a good decision right now? I'm looking at my wife like, is that gonna work? Girl is like, no. I'm such a loser with my capabilities right now. I play no useful role in all of this. The teenager then reveals that her mom is on the tribal council. She said everyone in the group is going to be in trouble over this. I didn't realize, but apparently that is important shit to people in that area. Guys in background are still yelling. A second fistfight ensues. Police finally get there. In short, police get the story told to them. I see eyebrows go up when the girl mentions who her mom is. They seemingly reluctantly pack the teenager into the car, and as soon as they move her into the car, she screams violently. Doors close and you can still hear that screaming. The fighting dudes in the group must have seen the lights and the commotion stopped. Police talk to them. Cops leave with the girl. Then it's quiet, close to 3 a.m. Shaken, the wife and I go back to our tent and discuss the next steps. Should we stay? We decided we were leaving first thing in the morning, but while lying there trying to sleep, the group again begins to shout at each other. Expletives more along the lines of, we're screwed, and screw you. Nope, we're out. So in the dark, we quietly pack the car. For some reason, the wife and I were concerned that the group would hear us. The tent goes in unfolded and fast. Once everything is in, when we start the car, suddenly one of the dudes from the fighting group sprints over to our parking lot like he's about to try and stop us. First time seeing him, shirtless skinny guy in shorts. I accelerate quickly towards him. He's in the middle of the lot, then turn toward the road and get out of there. nearly 3 hours of driving back to the city. This story is an encounter my grandmother had back in early 2001. My grandma and grandpa just moved into a very isolated cabin in the North Georgia mountains to escape the fast-paced city life after they retired. The house was perched on the side of a mountain on about 5 acres of their property, with a very long gravel driveway from the so-called main road which connected the surrounding cabins. The closest house was about 1 or 2 miles away as the crow flies, and 3 to 4 miles by road. So yeah, definitely a low-key spot that's very hard to find. Soon after they purchased the property, they began the moving process, and both grandparents ended up making separate runs from their old house to the new house. One night, my grandmother was alone at the new house in the mountains, while my grandpa was back at the old house taking care of some final business and last-minute packing. He decided to stay there for the night and avoid the 2-hour drive back to the new house, in turn leaving my grandmother alone in the middle of nowhere. She was fine with it and decided to go ahead and sleep to prepare for more moving the next day. At around 1 a.m., the house was dead silent, and all of a sudden there was a very loud knock at the front door. Now keep in mind, you could easily hear someone if they drove up the driveway, but she never heard a car. The front door was all glass, so it basically sounded like someone was banging on a window. She was terrified to say the least, and decided to stay in bed and wait it out. The knocks came again, this time even louder. At this point, her adrenaline and fear is through the roof, not knowing who could possibly be at the door this late at night, in the middle of nowhere. Once again, she stays in bed and waits it out. About 5 minutes pass, and there are no more knocks. She waits even longer to maybe hear a car drive away or something, but no car ever drove off. The only way someone could have been there is if they walked several miles through the woods to get there, or walked up the very long driveway. Nothing else ever happened that night, and nothing ever came of it. Still, a pretty strange and creepy occurrence for such an isolated place. So this happened when I was much younger. I want to say freshman in high school, probably like 2008. There used to be this road near where I lived in California called Croak Road. It was barely a road, no one traveled on it, and it was surrounded by small patches of forest and some abandoned barns and houses. I would typically go there with my friends to skateboard and hang out. This one night, I was hanging out with 2 of my friends, Lucas and Dorian, and someone wanted to go to Croak Road to hang out since it was creepy at night. It might sound lame, but we loved exploring like a bunch of 5th graders, and weren't really into smoking or anything, so what else was there to do? I asked my 20-year-old brother, James, if he could drive us down into one of the nature reserves by the road. This specific reserve was larger than the others and had a network of gravel paths leading through it. Basically, we were looking for unexplored territory to hike in. Soon, one particular path we were traveling down had become so narrow, James' Ford Explorer couldn't pass through it. So we got out and walked for a while, chatting and just having fun. We walked through the woods for about half an hour until it had gotten relatively dark out and the sun was gone. At which point we turned around to head back to the car. It's now I should mention that despite being near a lot of subdevelopments, this patch of forest was huge. I'd say about 1,000 acres, and rarely visited since it was easy to get lost in, especially at night. It was a challenge getting the car turned around, but James managed it, and we were off down the road. Dorian proposed we turn down a different path we had passed by earlier, since we had about 40 minutes until our parents wanted us back, and we agreed. Down this path was a tiny pond Dorian wanted to check out to take pictures of, since he hadn't gotten the opportunity to visit it at night. It was slow going since this road was even crappier than the main one we were traveling on that turned off to Croak Road. Minutes later, we got into a slight argument. Dorian was convinced James had taken a wrong turn since we should have arrived at the pond by now, while James claimed that he had been driving straight the whole time. It was dark after all. Eventually, we came to a fork in the road that none of us were familiar with. None of us knew which way to go, so we ended up guessing and going left, hoping that both directions would ultimately lead us back to the main path. None of us were scared or anything. In fact, we were actually excited and intrigued, driving through seemingly the middle of nowhere at night. It was at this point we rounded a small bend in the road, and the headlights fell upon a surreal sight. There were 4 figures emerging from the forest and crossing the road, wearing what looked to be long cloaks with the hoods up and holding flashlights. One guy at the back of the group was dragging a large duffel bag, a human-sized duffel bag. We all froze and stopped mid-conversation, and as soon as our high beams landed on the 4 figures, they froze as well. James pulled to the left and went around them. Driving past them felt like an eternity, because we couldn't have been going over 5 miles an hour due to the shitty condition of the road. Sitting in the passenger seat, I could see them inches beyond my window, and they were indeed wearing black robes and holding flashlights. I didn't get a good look at the bag, but judging by the way the guy was holding it, something heavy was inside the bag. None of us said a word until the road straightened out and we were past these guys, at which point James just muttered, "What the hell was that?" We continued down the road in silence until I heard Lucas say, "Holy shit!" and repeat himself in a louder, much more panicked voice. He said, "They're coming back!" I twisted around in my chair to see Lucas pointing out the back window. I could barely see anything, but about 100 yards away we saw the beams of 4 flashlights shaking erratically. The guys were without a doubt running after us. All of us screamed at James to floor it, and he sped down the road. The car was bouncing and shaking uncontrollably as we flew over berms and potholes. I kept my eyes on the flashlight beams until we rounded another bend in the road, and they were out of sight. Thankfully, the path did manage to take us back to the main path. James gunned it down the path until we popped off by Croak Road and got the hell out of there. The weirdest thing about it was, there couldn't have been a vehicle anywhere near those guys for 50 miles in either direction. We would have seen one if there had been. We had explored most of the area before, and there wasn't anywhere to pull off the road and park. We didn't say anything more until we got back to my place. We talked about it for a bit, and then my friends went home and James and I went to bed. I didn't know if we should call the cops or not, but James, who I'd guess would be the adult in the situation, seemed reluctant, so I dropped it. I never told my parents until just before writing this, and they kind of scolded me for not telling them, and that we should have contacted the authorities, just to report the suspicious people in the preserve. I still wish to know how the hell they got there, where they were going, and what was in the bag. In the mid-'80s, my mama worked at my school. I was in nursery. To get to school, she always took a shortcut over the heath. About 2 weeks earlier, a local girl in her late teens who my family vaguely knew went missing. The last time someone saw her, she was over in the heath. Mama said she wasn't that concerned by this, as she practically grew up over there. It was summer in the middle of the day, and the route she took was quite busy with other people walking their dogs and golfing. One day, Mama set off. Halfway to school, she stopped, thinking she was being stared at. She looked over her shoulder, and at the top of the small hill she had just walked down was a big man in biker's leather and a helmet. She said she couldn't see his face, but she had the uneasy feeling that he had been watching her for some time. She said it was funny because she hadn't seen him coming down the hill, but there was a heavily wooded area opposite the hill, and Mama said she thought he might have walked through there. That would explain why she hadn't seen him before. Mama said she felt uneasy by his stillness and interest, so she walked a little faster, and soon there was a healthy distance between her and the stranger. On the way home later that day, she decided to get the bus home instead of walking. A week later, the body of the teenage girl was discovered by a dog walker, in the same wooded area opposite the hill where the strange biker man had been watching Mama. There was a police search, and they appealed for information and witnesses. Mama contacted them and made a statement telling them about the mystery man on the hill. The police never did solve the murder of the poor local girl, and Mama never walked that way to work again. I remember when I was back in my teens, I'm 25 now, that there was a small wooded area not far from my house in Indiana. I used to hang out back there with my friends Jeff, Marcus, and Brittany, since there wasn't much else to do. We would smoke cigarettes or whatever else we could find out there, since we never ran into people. One of the times we were out there, we went further back than we had ever gone. This patch of woods was a few miles in diameter, so I guess you would just call it the woods. but since it was right outside of town, I never felt like we were in the woods. Anyways, we went back further than ever, and we came across an old broke-down cabin. It still had something of a roof, and the walls were more or less still up. It looked like it might have been built back in the 1800s. My friend, Jeff, went around the place to see if anyone might be squatting in there. We didn't have a homelessness problem in town, but you never know what you might find out there. There weren't any signs of trash around the place, so we figured it must be empty and went in. Inside didn't match the outside. There was only one room and an old potbelly stove to the left with some rundown cabinets that must have been where the kitchen was. Also, over by the stove was a sleeping bag, and there was a pile of tin cans next to that. We all immediately felt creeped out, not because it was scary, but because we were intruding on someone's space. Jeff went out first, but before I got through the door, Marcus said, "Guys, what the hell is this?" In the far corner of the room, wrapped in a few layers of blankets, were the remains of a skeleton, or at least close to one. Most of the skin was gone, and it looked like some animals had already gotten to it. It was past the point of smelling strongly, though. Brittany freaked out and ran as fast as she could. Marcus just stared at it, unable to comprehend what he had seen, and Jeff said that we needed to report it to the police. I got out of there too and waited for the boys outside. We had had a pretty harsh winter that year, and most likely this homeless guy had frozen to death out there. It was late summer by the time we found the body. This isn't as scary as it is sad, but I wanted to tell my story. It still kind of freaks me out a bit, but I also kind of want to cry, thinking of that poor person out there just trying to stay warm.